Welcome back. We're continuing our study in the book of James. In this session, we will begin to look at chapter 1. Last time, we delved into the different aspects of James, the author, James, the character in the book of Acts. We talked about how his name actually wasn't James. His name was almost assuredly Jacob, as it's preserved in the Greek, and as we see it also coming down from Aramaic and Hebrew. We talked about how there's both biblical background to James, the brother of Jesus. We saw how his life was characterized before the resurrection of unbelief. He didn't believe that his brother was the Son of God. He didn't believe that he was the Messiah, and it took the resurrection, and not just the resurrection, but the specific appearance, as Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 15:7, of the risen Lord to James personally, to change his life. And we see over the course of the book of Acts and Galatians and other parts of the New Testament, the character of James and how he was willing to not only accept that his brother was the Messiah, what something to accept, but that he was willing to lead the church in Jerusalem in the hotbed of persecution from the Jewish establishment there, and lead it well, even lead it up to the point of his own death, being killed by that very establishment that he had seen kill his own brother. So this character of James is endlessly fascinating, and even though we don't normally consider James to be up there with Peter and John, or of course Paul, he had a huge impact upon the early church, as we saw last time. Paul calls him, as well as Peter and John the Apostle, the pillars of the church, the pillars of the early Christian community. This was the basic framework, the structure of which the early church was built. And so this is a critical character and someone we should pay close attention to. Now, in the book of James itself, we have some teachings from James, and we'll talk about the nature of these teachings as we work through, but it's really the only place that we have, except for a few examples in the book of Acts, where we get words from James. And it's an extended teaching. It's 5 chapters. It's a letter, and we'll talk about whether it's a letter or how we should understand it a little bit later on. But it's our only real information that we have from James himself that describes his theology and his teachings, and it's very, very interesting. It's I wouldn't say overly complex, but it's filled with wisdom. It's really a wisdom book, almost in the way of Proverbs or the book of Ecclesiastes or Job. It has a lot of those same features. But one of the big features, and something that I want us to focus on intently as we look closely at this book, is the role of Christ's teaching in the Gospels, and particularly the Gospel of Matthew, in the book of James. The book of James is absolutely peppered with sayings from Christ, sayings from Jesus, many of them from the Sermon on the Mount. And James is using these teachings to make many of the same points that Jesus is making, in particular about the idea that true religion has these deeper truths of caring for widows and orphans, or loving your neighbor as yourself. He talks about this being the law of liberty, and how that this faith that they have, this loyalty in Jesus as the King and as the Messiah, is critical. But going alongside that faith is these works that must actually happen if it to be shown as true faith. And so it's a book that I love. It's a book that I've spent not, I wouldn't say a huge amount of time in, because most of my time I'm spending in the historical books in the Old Testament, but it's deeply personal to me because I actually studied it when I was in college. I remember going through this in, I think it was second or third year Greek, and the professor, his name is William Varner, he was writing a commentary on it at the time. And so for me, it was the first time to study a book, not just to understand, what can I glean from it, but how does this book work? What is the sources that it's drawing from? What is its main message? Not just in this particular verse or in this particular paragraph or in this particular chapter, but what is it doing big picture? And to be honest, James is a hard one. It's not always so easy to see where the markers of his arguments are, or his discourse, wherever they lie. But to me, it was just a great experience of seeing how these things function and work together. And I hope it will be to you. But one of the great things about the book is that so much of the book can be understood simply by reading it. And that's what I would actually really encourage you to do. As we go through James, just read through the whole book. It's 5 relatively short chapters. It's easy to read. Things sound like Jesus because many of them are allusions to the Sermon on the Mount. And I think you'll find as you read, there's a deep level of encouragement there to be had. That it's just stating wise sayings that are so impactful for your life. And so with that said, let me go ahead and show you what we're going to be looking at today. Let me make my screen a little bit bigger so you can see me. I'll be up here in the right-hand corner. And so as we've been saying, the book of James is, of course, written by James, the brother of Jesus. One of the really interesting and important things about this book is its date. Now, we don't know for sure when it was written. Many of the books in the New Testament don't give us or really any indication about when they were written. That's why they're heavily debated. Galatians, for example, gives us a lot of chronological material, and so we can date it pretty well and pretty early into the late 40s AD. Now, this particular book, James, is normally dated very, very early. In fact, some people consider it to be, if not the earliest New Testament book, then one of the earliest. And that's important for several reasons. One of the most important reasons is that the material that we have in the book of James, as I said, is filled with sayings of Jesus. So we have, for instance, James quoting or alluding to many things that Jesus says on the Sermon on the Mount. Because it's within a decade, almost a decade or a decade and a half of Jesus's death and resurrection, if he died and rose from the dead in 33 AD, this is written in 44 to 48, that means we're within a decade or a decade and a half of Jesus's sayings and then being recorded down in this form, which is actually, most scholars believe, much earlier than the Gospels. And so that's a very important point in the book. It also shows you the development of what's happening in the Christian community. We'll read later in chapter 2 how James is going to make reference to meeting in a synagogue. Now, we do know that Jewish Christians, those following this new Christian movement who were Jews, continue to meet in synagogues. Many of them may have met in homes. But this is an interesting development. What is this transition that's happening between death, burial, resurrection, 40 days, ascension, and then Pentecost, boom, we have this new thing starting in Acts chapter 2. How is it transitioning in Acts language from Judea, Jerusalem, Samaria, and then to the ends of the earth? How is that happening? Well, that's talked about in a geographical context, but what about the cultural context of even removing Gentiles from this discussion, because James doesn't really deal with Gentiles, but how did Jews actually become Christians? How did Jews relate to this idea of following Jesus as the Messiah? Well, James talks about that. He deals with the messianic diaspora. And that's a word we'll spend some time on and in just a minute, we look at the greeting. He's writing to Jewish Christians. That is, Jews who believe Jesus is the Messiah, the one who was promised. And he's specifically writing, as we know, because James lived in Jerusalem. In fact, you can see below me here on the screen, you have an image of the Second Temple of Jerusalem as it looked just days before its destruction, or at least an artistic representation. You have over here the temple there, and the Royal Stoa and the Temple Mount, which is still standing mostly today, and the entrances to the temple. And over here is the Herodian palace where Jesus was likely tried. This is where James lived, which is really an interesting thing when we think about the fact that he was a Galilean. He grew up in Nazareth, was born in Nazareth. He spent time with Jesus in Capernaum, and yet once Jesus appears to him, he's in Jerusalem. And so after 33 AD, this is his home. This is where he is living until his death, stoned in this very temple that we are looking at, according to Josephus. We talked about it last time. And so he's ministering to the flock here, but he's also writing this letter outside of it. He's going to send it out to those who are in the diaspora. And this is what we call the occasion. What occasion prompted the writing of the book of James? Why did James decide that this book needs to be written? Well, that's actually kind of a hard question to answer. We don't know exactly why James decided to write the book. We do know, again, we can date the writing of the book to the mid to late 40s AD, and it does say that he wrote it to the diaspora. Now, that word diaspora means scattering. And it's a word that's well known in discussions of Judaism, because until today there is a very large diaspora. And you might ask, what does this word mean? How does it relate? Well, there's a series of events that occur in Jewish history that relate mainly back to the time of the Old Testament. In 722 BC, the Israelite kingdom, that's the northern tribes, or the 10 tribes are sometimes called, they are defeated. Samaria is destroyed, and they're exiled into Assyria. The lost 10 tribes are sometimes called. Well, about 150 years later, in 586 BC, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of the Babylonians, he comes to Jerusalem. He sacks the city. I should say his commander does. And the rest of the Jews living in Jerusalem and many in the kingdom of Judah are sent into exile. They go to Babylon, which you can see here on the map over here on the right-hand side. And for 70 years, they're there. And some do return in 539, 536, and several other returns. But for the most part, most of them stay in this vicinity. And they begin to spread out to different parts. And even after this, even those living in Jerusalem undergo different diasporas. For instance, when Jerusalem is conquered by the Romans in 63 BC by Pompey, he enslaves some Jews and sends them to different parts of the Roman Empire. And so if we think about the Jews of the Roman Empire, they're really everywhere. They're scattered throughout the Roman Empire. They're in Rome, they're in Athens, they're in Greece, they're in Turkey, they're throughout. And a large portion of them are in Egypt, especially in Alexandria. And so even though Judea and Galilee are very much a main part of where Jews are living, they're spread throughout. And we also know that from the book of Acts. We can read Acts 2. We won't do that here, but it lists all these nations that are really scattered throughout the Mediterranean. These are where the Jews are in the diaspora. And they're there in Jerusalem because of Pentecost and the celebration there, not knowing that it's at that moment that they're going to be saved. That they're going to, as Peter says, they're going to call upon the name of the Lord and be saved and be baptized on that very day. Well, those Jews that are there at Pentecost in 33 AD, they spread out. They go to all these different places throughout the Mediterranean. And many of them perhaps begin their own churches. We don't really know. It's to these that Paul will eventually go in his various missionary journeys. And so we can say that perhaps one idea of the occasion of the writing is James simply writing to those Jews in the diaspora who have believed, perhaps as a result of Pentecost, perhaps as a result of the initial ministry done among these synagogues. Another option, and this is what some scholars would hold to, and I'll move you down here so you can see. This is what some scholars hold to, is that if you look in Acts chapter 11, verse 19, I'll just read this passage. It says, "Now those who were scattered because of the persecution that arose over Stephen traveled as far as Phoenicia and Cyprus and Antioch, speaking the word to no one except Jews." Now, many times when we read these types of passages in the Bible, we just skip over these place names and just get over to find the theological point. Well, these details actually tell us a lot. They tell us something about a chronology, and they tell us something about geography. The death of Stephen happens very early, perhaps within the first year or two after the death of and resurrection of Jesus. And this is also the background to Paul's conversion. Of course, he's on the way to Damascus to persecute those who were Christians who were there when the Lord appears to him. But this detail here in Acts 11 tells us that there was a persecution which is being established from Jerusalem, from the Sanhedrin, and it had caused those who had been in Jerusalem who believed to scatter to these locations, the area of Phoenicia, the area of Antioch, and the area of Cyprus. Now, we don't know a whole lot about Phoenicia, but we know a lot about this region. We don't know a lot about what's happening there in terms of early Christians, but we know a lot about Cyprus. Cyprus, of course, I should say of course, but it's the home of Barnabas. It's also going to be where Paul is going to go initially on his first missionary journey. Antioch is, of course, going to be the establishment of the main church community outside of Jerusalem. And so perhaps James is writing to this first group of the diaspora. And so perhaps if we're thinking of a circulation of this letter that James writes, it's sent to these communities of this first diaspora. Although, to be fair, we don't know that for sure. It's quite possible that it refers to this wider diaspora. And again, we'll talk about where that word, it appears right in the very first verse. We'll get to there in just a minute. Now, a couple other things as we look at this book. What is the book of James? That's a big question that we have to encounter when we approach the book, because even though it's a letter, it has this opening and it ends with these words as a greeting, like Paul. It's not the same as Paul. It's not the same kind of letter as Paul's letters are. It again does have this letter in form, but it has more in common, we might say, with the book of Hebrews than it does with the writings of Paul. Some have considered it to be a collection of sermons that James has given over time, and he's giving these collections of sermons to the wider diaspora. And I actually think that this is quite a nice way of interpreting it, particularly when we consider that much of James's material comes from Jesus's material. And I like to think about this a lot, this relationship that James and Jesus would have had, both before James believed and after he believed in that short period of time. And of course, not just the short period of physical contact, but the eternal aspect of that as well. And so James is going to be present at so many of these teachings that Jesus gave, both on the Sermon on the Mount and other places. And it's, even though he's not believing at the time, it's going to be that word of truth that is implanted deep down within him, that he's later going to use to deliver to the church community. And so even though he, again, doesn't believe, it's the stuff that comes out of him as a result of his close contact with his brother. Now, as far as trying to understand the theme, I talked about this a little bit earlier, it's difficult to determine the theme. It's hard to know what the flow of the narrative is. What's the peak? I should say, what's the flow of the text? Not narrative. It's not a story. It's a letter. It's like a sermon. Where is the peak? Where is the point? You might say. Well, we'll make some suggestions later on, but it's definitely eclectic. It includes all these wise sayings that are put together much in the same way we would think of, particularly the book of Proverbs or the apocryphal books of Sirach or the Wisdom of Solomon. These wise sayings that kind of flow off one another. He's got this point here, and maybe he's got this big point that he's trying to make. Oh, but he's got this rabbit trail, and he's going to make this point based off this rabbit trail, this digression here, this digression here. And so it's, if we're trying to always track exactly how these arguments fit into a bigger argument, it's not exactly that kind of book. If you want that, read Romans. It builds argument upon argument upon argument, leading to these beautiful statements that Paul makes. But James has its own beauty and its own points to make. And actually, that's another point that we should highlight, is that one of the controversies of the book of James is going to be its relationship to the book of Romans, and in particularly its relationships to Paul's theology. Now, as I said, lots of similarities to Jesus' teaching, particularly Jesus' teaching on the Sermon on the Mount. And then finally, I'll give you this up front, I am persuaded, and again, this is not my idea, but that the peak of the book, the key idea, is James 3:13-18, and specifically this idea that you should be wise and to have wisdom from above versus the wisdom from below. It's these two ways, these two ideas of earthly wisdom versus heavenly wisdom that is going to be seen in chapter 1, but it's going to really come together in chapter 3, where James is going to ask the question, who then is wise? And he says, well, go and follow wisdom from above versus wisdom from below. Now, this takes us to a place that we need to go before we dive into other aspects of the book, and that is Martin Luther's assessment. Here's a good look at the great reformer here, now some 500 years since the beginning of the Restoration. Now, Martin Luther, of course, is well known for many wonderful things that he did. He also did some things believed some things and taught on some things that were less great, including his view on Jews, which we won't get into here. But one of the things that he is most controversial for is his take on the book of James. And I'll just read his own words, or the translation of his German. In a word, St. John's Gospel, which would be the Gospel of John, and his first epistle, 1 John, St. Paul's epistles, especially Romans, Galatians, and Ephesians, and St. Peter's first epistle are the books that show you Christ and teach you all that it is necessary and salvatory for you to know, even if you were never to see or hear any other book of doctrine. That's true. They're excellent books, and I'm not going to criticize those books. But here's where, again, it gets pretty controversial. St. James's epistle is really an epistle of straw compared to the others, for it has nothing of the nature of the gospel about it. Now, if you were to read the entire quote, he does say that it should be in the canon. He says there's some good things about it, but it's this specific coin of phrase, this term that he says, the epistle of straw, that has really lived on in a negative way towards Luther's assessment of the book of James, because quite honestly, the book of James is fantastic. It's a beautiful book. It's filled with Jesus teaching on every page. And this is something that is unfortunate when Martin Luther looked at it. And yet, we can understand why to some extent. And we'll really focus in on that in chapter 2 especially, where James is going to use the same verse from Genesis 22 that Abraham is reckoned righteousness, that is quoted by Paul in Romans, and he's going to use it in a very different way than Paul is. And in particular in that chapter, James 2, we have this idea of works, faith without works being dead, which if we think about it in Martin Luther's context of where he is trying to champion the idea, the foundational, critical, totally important, and I believe true idea of justification by faith alone, without works, we could see where the rub would be. But I would say, and most evangelicals, most Protestants would all say that maybe Martin Luther was a little bit critical on this point. Now, to be fair, and I didn't study this in too much depth, but apparently Martin Luther, over the course of his life and ministry, used James and apparently became much more comfortable with the theology that was taught there. In any case, this is a good introduction to some of the controversies in the book. Well, here's the outline of chapter 1 that we're going to delve into today. In fact, in this session, we'll get just as far as the greeting before we get into these next 3 sessions, or these next 3 groups that appear in the book of James. So let's take a look at that greeting. We're finally at the beginning of the book. James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes which are in the dispersion, greetings. So as we look at this opening line, what immediately jumps out to me is his relationship to both God and the Lord Jesus Christ. Now, for Paul, which all of Paul's letters start like this, and you can also look at Peter and John's epistles and Jude's as well, they start with this information. But here, there's something really fantastic. And that is not only the fact that he is a servant, or doulos, sometimes we can translate as a slave or servant of God, but also of the Lord Jesus Christ. To make such a statement, knowing what we know, for James or Jacob to say that his older brother is the Lord Jesus, and again, Christ is not his last name, it's his title, the Messiah, is really something. Now, I can talk to this to some extent. Like many of you, perhaps, I've been watching the Last Dance of Jordan's Bulls, and I remember as a kid following closely this. And I actually wasn't a Bulls fan. My brother was. Josh was a Bulls fan, and I was a big Spurs fan, and still am. But there was this as you watch this deep rivalry that they have, that Jordan and these others have with management, with these other teammates, and this competition that's there. And of course, I remember that as well as a kid, and even until today, if I'm admitting it, even out there on the basketball court with my son, and of course with my brothers and many others, this rivalry that you have with others. It's this familiarity you have with your family that makes it hard to necessarily understand all the time and give you perspective on who or what they actually are when seen from the outside. And James had that. I mean, James lived with an older brother who was the Lord Jesus Christ. I mean, that is something that none of us have had to live through. It's both probably a blessing and definitely a blessing, but also was difficult. In fact, this is just kind of another side here. One of my other favorite teachers, Doug Bookman, who's now a professor at Shepherd's Theological Seminary in North Carolina, he always likes to talk about, the idea that Jesus grow in wisdom and knowledge in the Lord, as it talks about in at the end of Luke 2, that he grows in this wisdom and stature and becomes knowing that he is the Messiah, that he is the Son of God. And Doug always likes to say that he imagines a situation when James and Jesus are in the stable or some other room and they're doing some chores, and Jesus looks over at Jacob or James and says, little brother, I think I'm the Messiah. I think I'm God in the flesh. I think I'm this, because he's coming to this knowledge. He's fulfilling all of these roles and responsibilities of who he is. Now, that may be a little bit much, but we can imagine this situation as Jesus is coming into the knowledge of who he is and what his responsibility is and what he's going to do over the course of his ministry. That James is one of those characters, one of his family members that was close to him, sleeping in the same room, sleeping in the same area, long trips to Jerusalem, three times a year, that he sees day to day, and he doesn't believe. He doesn't believe he's the Messiah. He doesn't believe he's the Son of God. He sees the miracles. He doesn't believe. We talked about that last time. He's there, perhaps at the cross. It's not James or Jude or his other brothers that are given charge of Mary. It's John the apostle. And it's not till he sees the risen Christ, his risen brother, that he believes. And so for him to make this statement, and he makes it a couple times in the book, is just truly extraordinary when we think about it. Now, the second part we've talked about a little bit, so I won't delve too much into it. These 12 tribes in the dispersion, these 12 tribes. And I'll say just a couple things about this. One, remember, it's Jacob to the 12 tribes. That has a much better ring to it. Of course, the 12 tribes are related to Jacob, whose name is changed to Israel. These 12 tribes are related to him. And so perhaps Jacob is playing on this idea. Of course, he doesn't see himself as Jacob, the founding father, but it ties this Judaism together, that they're part of this true Israel, this true Israel that's going to be restored. And he's writing to them as he looks out at beginning of this epistle. Well, we're out of time for this session. As we wrap up and we think about as we think about the beginning of this book and where this book is going to take us, I want us to be left with these realities that James has this revolutionary change in his life as a result of seeing the risen Lord, that totally transforms him to the point where he is going to live his life up to the point of death, and serving in the Jerusalem church in the service of his king, who happens to be his brother. And so that is the type of faith that all of us must have, a faith that works, a faith that works all the way until the end, given whatever calling we are called to. And over the course of this book, we'll see how there's going to be specific ways in which James is going to tell us about how that faith is supposed to work in terms of caring for widows and orphans, in terms of the wealthy and the poor, and how they're all part of the same community. In particular, how Christians need to abstain from worldliness. James 4 really stands out as he says that to be friends with the world is to have enmity with God, to be an enemy of God. And many of these wise teachings are going to emanate from James, showing us about how to be wise, to be perfect, which really means to be mature and full, is to follow in this faithfulness in the Lord. Well, we'll continue this in our next session.